We live in the most amazing time in human history, an inflection point, which will be seen in the long term as a critical moment. It's a time when we need to think very deeply about the choices we make and ensure that we wisely go forward. Because we're at a crossroads for humanity. The decisions we take over the coming months and years will shape the future of humanity for generations to come. This is an inflection point which has been compressed by COVID-19. And as terrible as this pandemic is, through all the suffering, it's given us a new opportunity to reset our societies in ways which lead to a totally different operating system. People talk about bouncing back, business as usual, as if that's something to aspire to. It scares me because it's business as usual which brought us to where we are today. It's business as usual which got us into this terrible mess, which led to the pandemic, which is leading to escalating climate change, which leads to cascading risks and growing inequality within our societies and between them. And so far from going back and resetting to an operating system which we already have, we need to think very deeply about the new operating system we need to move to, a different one. We need radical reform. This isn't simply an upgrade. This is a transformation that will lead to a different way of operating as societies, different behaviors, different roles of governments, and most of all, different attitudes towards each other, within our countries, and between them. When we think about this time, we'll think about the suffering, the loneliness, and the extraordinary, deep reflections that we've all had, whether it's about nature around us, about our friends and family, about our time. And we desperately yearn for a time which is different. And of course, we look forward to parting, to having a great time, hugging each other, celebrating, catching up on fun, on friends, on family, and all the things we hold dear. But as we're doing so, let's remember the roaring 20s that followed the First World War and the terrible pandemic of 1918, which was even more ghastly than the pandemic we're experiencing today. That roaring 20s is still celebrated as a time of parting, of a new age of jazz, new styles, the Great Gatsby. But what we should also remember is it was the beginning of a new end, the Great Depression, which was a terrible time of mass bankruptcy and unemployment, leading to rising populism, to an even worse World War, the Second World War. And although the First World War was meant to be the war that ended all wars, as H.G. Wells said, it was a precursor, as was the pandemic of 1918, to an even worse and cascading series of crises. Let's make sure we don't repeat that terrible history. The Second World War was a much better experience in that respect. The suffering was much greater, but the leaders were wiser. Churchill, Roosevelt, and others recognized that the cycle could not be repeated. And so in the midst of the war, while the bombs were dropping on Whitehall, while they were fighting on five fronts, while the UK was in danger of being invaded and blockhouses were being built to repel the Nazi invasion, at that time, they prepared for a new world. They were determined that the cycle of crises had to stop, and that the people that were suffering would not suffer in vain, that the youth that had given so much would look forward to a better future, have a better future than their parents. And so the welfare state was born, the creation of a national health service, the guarantee of full employment, the provision of public housing, the creation of mass education, the rights of citizens to flourish, not only in the UK, but in the US too, and across Europe. And so the Second World War gave rise to what's known as the Golden Age of capitalism. In French, the Trente Glorieuses, the glorious 30 years. And in the US, in Europe, and in the UK, there was indeed a time of unprecedented flourishing for societies, not only domestically, but through the creation of a more stable and inclusive world order. Because the focus was not only on home, but it was on the creation of a United Nations system, which would guarantee that that was the war to end all world wars. The creation of the Marshall Plan, giving money to the losers, to the enemies, so that they could enjoy the fruits too of this new world order, leading to the huge regeneration of Japan, of Germany, of Austria, and of course, the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and others, to ensure a more inclusive world. The funding of infrastructure, the funding of education, of health around the world. That vision lasted for 30 years and created an unprecedented time of progress. It was funded through higher taxation, tax rates of over 70% in the UK, across Europe, in the US. Willingly, an active state and a massive regeneration and development of private enterprise and a time of full employment. Today, we're in a totally different world. A race to the bottom in taxation, the withering of the state, and the withering of international institutions, which has given rise to this terrible situation we're in. The absolute strangulation of global institutions through a drip feed of too little money, too little mandate for reform, too little leadership by the institutions that own them, which is our countries. The rich countries dominate these international institutions, but we haven't allowed them to fulfill the need which we urgently have, which is to manage this hyper-integrated global system. And we also haven't allowed our national governments to provide the foundations for development. Because since the Thatcher-Reagan austerity revolution of the late 1970s, our governments have contracted, tax rates have gone down dramatically, less than half of what they were in most countries in the post-war period. And with that, a much weaker capability of governments. In Maggie Thatcher's world, there was no such thing as society, only individuals. The results of this we're seeing today. And if we want a safer, more stable world and more inclusive societies, we're going to need to re-engage with the radical reforms that created that glorious period of growth following the Second World War, with more active governments and more active societies, civil societies, businesses that are committed to society, voluntary organizations, trade unions, and others. Is this possible? Well, much of this has already happened. We've seen in this radical transformation, we've seen our behaviors change in dramatic ways, and we've seen governments change in dramatic ways. And although radical reform sounds scary, it's far, far less scary than the alternatives, which are dystopian futures. And so we need to embrace change. We need to see that after we've celebrated, after we've come together, that we don't only clap for the essential workers, but that we actually reward them with more decent wages. That we don't only say that we're an integrated world and that disease anywhere is disease at home, but that we act on it to make the World Health Organization the fighting force to ensure that this is the pandemic, to stop all pandemics. And there's absolutely no reason why it shouldn't be. We have the technological capability to ensure that. Through the spreading of vaccines globally, we need to ensure that we create a world of shared health, public health. And of course, many countries have suffered from an economic emergency, which will kill far more people than the pandemic itself through starvation and poverty. And so we need to reach out much, much more significantly than we have. Of the $12 trillion that the rich countries have found for themselves to support their workers and their businesses, less than 1% has gone to support developing countries. In stark contrast to in previous crises like the 2008-9 financial crisis, this time we've been much more selfish. There's been very little global solidarity. And although what this pandemic demonstrates is our integrated world, not only in how the pandemic and the virus has spread around the world, but also, of course, through the solutions. The vaccines are a tribute to global collaboration, which has never been deeper in science. And we yearn to have them shipped from elsewhere to our societies and distributed as they must be to all. And so the learnings from this pandemic need to be taken forward. The solidarity of the young for the old has been simply remarkable. Young people of school age have more chance of being struck by lightning in the UK than dying of COVID-19. And at university age, more chance of being killed in a car accident. And yet, they've given up their education, their social lives, many people their jobs prospects, inheriting a massive debt in order to protect the elderly. That solidarity should give way to guarantee to young people of a better future. The prospects at the moment are not good, and that's why we need not to go back to business as normal, but to go forward to a world where we say to young people, we will address the challenges of the future. We will ensure that climate change is stopped, that this is the pandemic to stop all pandemics, that we stop escalating crises. We will, through higher taxation, through more active governments, create more effective education systems, create jobs, an enabling environment, and also reward many of the jobs which are not currently rewarded, not least in the arts, which have been devastated by the pandemics, care homes, creative industries. In the world of the future, automation and robotics will do many of the repetitive jobs. And so we need to focus on what's uniquely human about us, which is our creativity, the magic that we bring through our thinking, through our ingenuity. Everyone, every day, in every place, has this capability. And so we need to harness the spirit of what makes us uniquely human, which we've rediscovered in the pandemic. We need to harness the spirit of solidarity, which we've rediscovered, of what workers really matter, and the recalibration of pay. And we need to harness the spirit of can do by governments to change the way they do things. We need to do this within our countries. And unlike the pandemic, except in the area of science, where there has been this solidarity, we need to show much more solidarity globally. There is no wall high enough that will keep out the great risks we face, be they climate change, pandemics, or other catastrophic risks. But what high walls do keep out is the willingness to cooperate, is the people, is the ideas, the technologies, the investments, the potential to work together. And so my hope is that this pandemic can rescue us, that we can go from global crisis to a better world, that we can learn from the pandemic about the choices that are open to us, that we can ensure that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past, but dedicate ourselves to a better world. And as we honor those that have suffered and those that have lost lives, let's ensure that this is the pandemic that rescues us and leads from a global crisis to a better world. Thank you.